He left me standing in front of everyone, flowers trembling in my hands, my heart breaking in slow motion. The whispers, the stares, the shame, it felt like the world ended right there at the altar. But what no one saw coming was the moment she walked forward. His sister. The woman everyone feared and admired, the CEO who carried power in every step. She didn't let me fall apart. She didn't let me drown in humiliation. Instead, she offered me something unthinkable, a marriage of convenience, a lifeline disguised as a promise. What began as a way to save face would become the one thing I never thought I deserved, real love. The wedding bells were supposed to be the happiest sound of her life, but instead they became a cruel reminder of silence. She stood frozen in front of the altar, the delicate lace of her gown clinging to her skin, her hands clutching the bouquet so tightly that petals bent and broke. Her heart pounded with each second that passed, each tick of the clock echoing like a drumbeat in her ears. The guests shifted in their seats, their voices a mix of pity, confusion, and gossip. Children whispered to their mothers, friends looked at each other with narrowed eyes, and she could feel every gaze piercing into her soul. She had rehearsed her vows 100 times, imagined his smile as he promised forever, and now all she had was emptiness. He was gone. He had left her standing there, humiliated and broken, with nothing but the sound of her own breath to remind her she was alive. The minister glanced toward the doors, his words faltering as if he too didn't know what to say. The best man's face had gone pale, and whispers spread like wildfire. Where is he? Did he run? How could he do this? She wanted to scream, to collapse, to vanish from this cruel moment, but her body betrayed her. She stood stiff and shaking, a statue carved out of heartbreak. The minutes stretched like hours, and still he didn't appear. The weight of betrayal pressed against her chest until it was hard to breathe. She thought of the promises he had made, the nights they had stayed up dreaming about a life together, the tender words that now tasted like lies. Rage and sorrow battled inside her, but neither gave her strength. She was simply empty, left behind in front of everyone who mattered, and then she saw her. Walking down the aisle, sharp heels clicking against the polished floor, a commanding presence that silenced the restless crowd. His sister. The CEO who people only spoke about in tones of awe or fear. She was known for her power, her cold resolve, the kind of woman who bent the world to her will. And yet, when her eyes met hers, something different flickered there, something soft, something almost protective. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood tall, as though shielding her from the cruel eyes around them. Then her voice came, steady and calm, cutting through the chaos. "He isn't coming," she said firmly, and a shiver ran through her at the blunt truth. No excuses, no softening. Just reality. But you won't be left here like this. Not today. She blinked in confusion, the words tumbling in her head, not making sense. What did she mean? How could she possibly fix this? But then, in front of everyone, the sister turned to the minister and said something that made the whole church gasp. "I'll take his place." The world seemed to tilt. For a moment, she thought she misheard, thought her mind had cracked under the pressure. But the stunned silence of the guests confirmed it. The CEO, the woman everyone saw as untouchable, had just offered herself in marriage. Shock rippled through the room, whispers louder than before, people rising from their seats in disbelief. She wanted to protest, to say no, to run far away from the suffocating air around her. But when she looked into those steady eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in anyone else that day: strength, certainty, and an unwavering promise that she wouldn't be left to drown in shame. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Why?" The sister leaned closer, her words quiet but firm. "Because no one deserves to be humiliated like this. Not you. Not here. And if marrying you is what it takes to protect you, then so be it." The gravity of the moment settled in her chest. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It was something colder, sharper, an act of defiance, of protection, of sheer willpower. Yet in her shattered state, it was the only hand being offered to her, and she couldn't bring herself to refuse. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Okay." The ceremony continued, not as planned but as something strange, surreal. The minister hesitated, his voice uncertain as he began the vows again, his hands shaking slightly as if unsure whether this was even allowed. The audience watched in stunned silence, half in disbelief, half in fascination. She repeated the words with trembling lips, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. Each promise felt hollow, but also heavy with meaning she couldn't yet grasp. When it came time for the ring, her hands shook so badly that the band slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor before the sister calmly bent down, picked it up, and slid it onto her finger with steady hands. The warmth of her touch lingered, a grounding presence in a storm of chaos. And then came the kiss. The final seal to a marriage that wasn't meant to exist. Their lips brushed, tentative and awkward, more out of necessity than desire. But in that fleeting touch, something stirred. It wasn't passion, it was something far more complicated. A strange comfort, a fragile promise that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. When it was over, the guests clapped, though the sound was scattered and uneasy, as if no one knew how to respond to what had just unfolded. Some faces were full of judgment, others of curiosity, and a few even of admiration. She felt their eyes burn into her as she walked down the aisle again, but this time her hand was firmly held in the sister's grip. Strong, unyielding, protective. Every step felt both surreal and heavy, as though she were marching into a future she couldn't predict, one she had never imagined. She had been left abandoned, humiliated, broken. But in the ashes of that heartbreak, she had also been bound to someone else, someone unexpected, someone dangerous, someone who had just rewritten the story of her life in front of the world. And though fear gnawed at her, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something she had never dared to hope for. The drive from the church felt like an endless tunnel, each second stretching into hours. She sat in the passenger seat of the sleek black car, the wedding dress bunching awkwardly around her legs, lace scratching against her skin, her hands twisting in her lap. The bouquet she once clutched with hope now lay abandoned on the seat beside her, wilted petals scattered across the leather. Her chest felt hollow, as if someone had scooped her heart out and left nothing but silence. She glanced sideways at the woman driving, the CEO, her new wife in name only. Her posture was rigid, her hands gripping the steering wheel with a precision that mirrored the control in her life. Her expression was unreadable, eyes fixed on the road ahead, jaw tight. Not a single word had passed between them since they left the church. The silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. She wanted to speak, to ask why, to ask what now, but her throat locked up every time she tried. Finally, she whispered, barely audible, "You didn't have to do that." The sister's eyes flickered toward her for a second, sharp but softened at the edges. "Yes, I did," she said quietly, her voice calm, controlled, carrying no trace of doubt. "I couldn't let them destroy you like that." The words lingered, heavy and confusing. Gratitude swelled in her chest, but so did fear. What did this mean for her life? For their lives? She was bound now, tied to a woman she barely knew, a woman she had only seen in passing at family gatherings, always in sharp suits, always with an air of distance. And now, that woman was her wife. The thought made her stomach twist. When they pulled into the grand driveway of the sisters' mansion, the weight of reality sank even deeper. The house loomed tall and intimidating, all glass and steel, designed to impress and intimidate anyone who entered. She felt small, out of place, a fragile porcelain doll stepping into a world built on strength and wealth. As they entered, the cool scent of polished marble and leather filled the air, a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth of the church. The sister led her through the vast hallway without a word, heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that echoed authority. She followed quietly, her dress dragging along, until they entered a spacious living room filled with muted tones and sharp edges. Everything about the space screamed control and power. It was the opposite of what she had imagined her married life would begin like. She had dreamed of a cozy home, laughter echoing through warm-colored rooms, shared glances of love and comfort. Instead, she was standing in a palace of cold beauty, beside a woman who was a stranger despite the wedding band now circling her finger. The silence grew unbearable until the sister finally spoke. "You must be exhausted," she said, her tone gentle but still firm. "You should rest. I'll have the staff prepare a room for you." The words "a room for you" cut into her, reminding her of the distance, of the fact that this was no real marriage, just an arrangement. She nodded mutely, her throat tight, and followed the maid upstairs to a bedroom that looked like something from a magazine, luxurious, immaculate, but lifeless. When the maid left, closing the door softly behind her, she collapsed onto the bed, the weight of the day crushing down on her chest. The gown felt suffocating now, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had been forced into. She tore at the lace, finally slipping it off, and curled into herself under the heavy blanket. Alone in the vast, unfamiliar room, tears spilled down her cheeks. She cried for the man who had abandoned her, for the humiliation she had endured, and for the terrifying uncertainty of what her future would look like. She cried until sleep dragged her under. When she woke, the room was bathed in soft golden light from the setting sun filtering through tall windows. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she heard a quiet knock, and the door opened slightly. The CEO stood there, no longer in her sharp wedding attire but in a simple blouse and trousers. She looked less like the untouchable executive and more like a human being. In her hands, she carried a tray with a bowl of soup and bread. "You haven't eaten," she said matter-of-factly, setting the tray on the nightstand. She sat up, startled, and tried to wipe away the evidence of her tears, but the sister's eyes caught it immediately. Her gaze softened, though her tone stayed steady. "Crying is normal. You don't have to hide it." The blunt honesty disarmed her, and for a moment she simply stared, unsure of how to respond. The soup smelled warm and comforting, and though she wasn't hungry, she found herself picking up the spoon. The first sip settled in her stomach like an anchor, grounding her. They sat in silence for a while, the sister standing by the window, her arms crossed, watching the fading light outside. Finally, she spoke again, her voice lower now. "I don't expect you to understand why I did what I did today. But know this, it wasn't out of pity. It was out of respect. You deserved better than to be left like that." The words made her chest ache. She set the spoon down and whispered, "I don't even know who I am right now. I thought I was going to be someone's wife, and now," her voice cracked, unable to finish. The sister turned to face her, her eyes unwavering. "Now you are someone's wife. Mine." The words weren't romantic, but they carried a strange weight, as if they were a vow of protection rather than affection. She didn't know whether to feel comforted or terrified. She lay back against the pillows, exhaustion pulling at her again, but her eyes stayed locked on the figure by the window. For the first time, she noticed the tension in the sister's shoulders, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the cracks in her otherwise unshakable facade. Maybe she wasn't as untouchable as the world believed. Maybe she too was carrying burdens no one else could see. As sleep tugged at her again, one thought stayed with her. She was no longer alone, even if the bond was built on circumstances neither of them had chosen. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something, a fragile thread connecting two broken hearts, stitched together in the ruins of a wedding that never happened. The morning after the wedding was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses on your skin and makes breathing feel like effort. She woke slowly, blinking against the soft light filtering through tall windows, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling and the weight of everything that had changed overnight. The gown was gone, folded neatly across a chair, replaced with a satin robe someone had left for her. For a fleeting second she forgot where she was, but then the memories of the church, the empty altar, the sister stepping forward, all came rushing back like waves crashing against a fragile shore. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring glinting faintly on her finger. The gold band mocked her with its permanence, whispering of vows she hadn't wanted, promises she hadn't chosen. She rubbed at it as if the metal would melt away, but it stayed firm, pressing against her skin like the truth she couldn't escape. When she finally left the room, the house seemed even larger in daylight, each hallway echoing with quiet. She wandered aimlessly until she heard voices. The low hum of staff speaking politely, the faint clinking of dishes. When she stepped into the kitchen, she found the CEO already there, dressed immaculately as if the day hadn't changed her world too. She was at the counter, sipping black coffee, her phone in hand, giving instructions in a calm, measured tone. She didn't look like someone who had married unexpectedly the day before. She looked like someone who had always been in control, like nothing could touch her. Their eyes met, and for a moment she faltered, unsure whether to speak. The CEO ended the call and set the phone down. "You should eat," she said simply, motioning toward the breakfast laid out on the table. Eggs, toast, fruit, everything prepared perfectly. She sat quietly, unsure if she even had the appetite, but the way the sister's eyes lingered on her made her pick up a piece of toast anyway. The act of eating felt strange, like pretending everything was normal when nothing was. After a while, the CEO sat across from her, folding her hands on the table. Her expression softened slightly. "There will be questions today. People will want answers. They'll want to know how this happened, why it happened. I'll take care of most of it, but you'll need to be ready too." Her heart sank at the thought of facing the world outside these walls. She had already felt the sting of whispers in the church. She didn't know if she could handle the judgment of an entire community. She lowered her gaze, her voice small. "What do I even say? I don't know what to tell them." The CEO's tone was calm, almost soothing. "You don't have to say much. Just stay by my side. Let me speak. People believe me because I've never given them a reason not to. That's the advantage of power, they'll swallow whatever story I feed them." The words sounded ruthless, but in that ruthlessness she felt a strange kind of safety. It was unnerving, but also reassuring. She nodded slowly, deciding that maybe letting the CEO take control was the only way she could survive the storm. By afternoon, the storm arrived. The press had gotten wind of the scandal. A man leaving his bride at the altar was a headline on its own, but the twist, the sister stepping in and marrying her, was too juicy for anyone to ignore. When they stepped outside, flashes from cameras assaulted them, reporters shouting questions in a frenzy. She froze, panic surging up her throat, but the CEO's hand slipped into hers, firm and grounding. "Smile," the sister whispered, her lips barely moving. "Don't let them see you break." She forced her lips into a faint curve, but her eyes burned with tears threatening to spill. The CEO stepped forward, her voice steady, commanding. "This was not a mistake. This was not a scandal. It was a choice, mine. My brother abandoned her, and I would not let her stand alone. I love her. I always have. Yesterday was just the day we admitted it." The words stunned her as much as they stunned the crowd. Love? That was a lie, a shield against the world's cruel judgment. But the way the CEO said it, with such conviction, made even her chest flutter with confusion. Reporters pressed closer, shouting follow-up questions, but the CEO never faltered, her answers sharp and rehearsed. She stood beside her, holding her hand, trying to look calm, and the cameras captured it all, the new couple, united, untouchable. Later, when the chaos faded and they returned inside, she collapsed onto the couch, her heart racing. "You lied," she whispered, though her voice carried more wonder than accusation. The CEO sat across from her, unbothered. "Of course I lied. That's what they needed to hear. The truth would only hurt you more." Her head spun with the weight of those words. Lies had built the foundation of this new marriage, yet somehow the lie had protected her from worse pain. She wanted to hate it, but part of her was grateful. She studied the CEO's face then, the cool confidence etched into her features, but also the faint shadows under her eyes. For a moment, she wondered if carrying this facade cost her more than she let anyone see. That night, the air was heavy with exhaustion. After hours of navigating calls, statements, and speculation, the CEO finally appeared at her bedroom door. She didn't barge in, she stood quietly, leaning against the frame. "You did well today," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "You didn't fall apart. That matters." She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. The CEO lingered a moment longer, her eyes unreadable, before finally saying, "We'll make this work. Somehow." And then she was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart aching with a mix of grief and something new she couldn't yet name. She hated that she felt safer beside the woman who had just turned her world upside down. She hated that she wanted to believe her. And most of all, she hated that beneath the fear and confusion, a small seed of trust had already been planted. The days that followed began to settle into a strange rhythm, though nothing about it felt normal. She woke each morning in the vast bedroom that smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood, but the air always carried an emptiness that reminded her she didn't belong. She would wander downstairs to find the CEO already awake, always perfectly dressed, always immersed in her phone or papers spread across the long dining table. Breakfast was quiet, almost ritualistic, plates of food brought by the staff, a few polite words exchanged, then silence thick enough to choke on. And yet, beneath that silence, something subtle shifted. She began to notice small things, the way the CEO always poured an extra cup of coffee without asking, the way her eyes flickered toward her as if checking she was still breathing, the way her voice softened slightly when she spoke directly to her. It wasn't love, not even close, but it was something that felt strangely like care, even if buried under layers of steel. One afternoon, they went grocery shopping together. A task so ordinary it felt absurd considering the spectacle of their so-called marriage. The driver stayed behind, and for once they moved through the aisles alone, without the shadow of reporters or cameras. She picked up a carton of milk, unsure if she should put it in the cart, when the CEO took it from her hand with a slight smirk. "That brand's terrible. Try this one instead." It was such a normal moment that it disarmed her, and she found herself laughing quietly, the sound surprising even her. The CEO glanced at her, her lips curving in something that almost looked like a smile, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. Still, the brief exchange lingered in her mind. These tiny glimpses of humanity in the woman she thought was nothing but steel walls chipped away at her fear, piece by piece. In the evenings, their conversations grew a little longer. At first, it was practical things, where she'd like to stay in the house, what events they'd need to attend as a couple, how to handle questions from curious relatives. But as the nights wore on, the topic softened. They began to share fragments of themselves. She found herself telling the CEO about her childhood dreams of becoming a writer, of filling notebooks with stories no one had ever read. In return, the CEO admitted something that surprised her. She had once wanted to be an artist, before her father demanded she take over the family business. For the first time, she saw not just the powerful executive, but a woman with sacrifices, regrets, and buried desires. One night, after dinner, she broke down. The weight of everything crashed over her all at once, the humiliation of being left at the altar, the pressure of pretending this marriage was real, the constant fear of disappointing everyone watching. She sat on the couch, clutching her knees to her chest, sobbing quietly into her arms. She expected the CEO to ignore it, to leave her alone with her grief. Instead, the woman sat beside her, silent at first, then gently reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her touch was delicate, almost hesitant, as though she feared breaking her. "You don't have to hold it all in," the CEO murmured. The words cracked her even more, and she collapsed against her, burying her face into the strong fabric of her blazer. To her surprise, the CEO didn't push her away. Instead, she wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steady and warm, letting her cry until her body trembled with exhaustion. Later, as they sat in the dim glow of the lamp, her tears finally drying, she whispered, "I don't understand you. You act so strong, like nothing can touch you. But then, you do this." The CEO's gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "Strength isn't about being untouchable," she said quietly. "It's about knowing when to let someone see the cracks." That confession lingered between them, heavy and intimate. She wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of this woman who had thrown herself into a marriage of convenience just to protect her. But instead, she leaned into the silence, letting the comfort of the moment fill the space where words failed. Over time, their bond grew in ways she hadn't expected. They shared late-night snacks in the kitchen, laughing over burnt toast like teenagers. They teased each other gently, finding humor in the absurdity of their situation. One evening, they sat side by side watching an old movie, the CEO's sharp comments making her laugh until her stomach hurt. She realized then how rare it was to laugh these days, how much she had missed the feeling of lightness. And with each shared smile, each quiet conversation, the walls around her heart began to crumble. She caught herself watching the CEO when she wasn't looking, the way her brow furrowed when she was deep in thought, the way her hand tapped lightly against her wine glass when she was restless, the way her eyes softened when they lingered on her a little too long. Still, there was tension simmering beneath it all. At night, when they parted ways to separate bedrooms, she lay awake with questions swirling. Was this just survival? Was the CEO only keeping up appearances, playing her role with ruthless efficiency? Or was there something else, something neither of them dared to name yet? The pull she felt was undeniable. Each time the CEO touched her hand in public, her heart jolted. Each time their eyes locked a second too long, her stomach fluttered. She knew she shouldn't feel this way. It had all started as a shield, a mask to protect her from humiliation. And yet, lying in bed, she couldn't stop imagining what it might feel like if the kisses they shared in front of cameras weren't just for show. That night, as she drifted into uneasy sleep, she realized something had changed. The marriage might have begun as a lie, but the emotions slowly weaving between them were real. Fragile, confusing, terrifying, but real nonetheless. And though she wasn't ready to name it, deep inside she knew the line between pretending and truth was beginning to blur. The air was heavy the morning they drove to the cemetery, the kind of stillness that makes every sound sharper, every silence louder. She had been dreading this visit ever since the thought of it first crossed her mind. The man who had promised to stand by her side forever was now just a ghost in her memory, and she needed to confront what was left of him. The CEO hadn't insisted but had quietly arranged it, the car waiting, her schedule cleared, her presence beside her steady and silent. The drive was quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because the weight of grief had pressed down on them both. She stared out the window at the blur of passing trees, her fingers clenched together, her stomach knotted. She told herself she didn't care, that he didn't deserve her tears, but she knew the truth. Love doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers like a wound that won't stop aching. When they arrived, the sky hung gray, the air damp with the threat of rain. The cemetery stretched out before them, rows of headstones whispering of loss and finality. She held the bouquet of lilies so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and when she reached the grave, her knees threatened to give out. The CEO stood a step behind her, tall and composed, but she could feel her presence like a shield at her back. She placed the lilies gently against the stone, her lips trembling as she read his name carved in the granite. Her vision blurred with tears she had promised herself she wouldn't shed. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you do this to me?" The question dissolved into the air, unanswered, as all such questions always were. She felt anger burning through the sorrow, anger at him for abandoning her, for choosing his own freedom over the life they had planned together. Her shoulders shook as she sank to her knees, clutching the cold stone as though she could drag an explanation out of it. The CEO moved then, kneeling quietly beside her, not speaking, just laying a hand on her back. The warmth of that touch was steadying, grounding her in a moment when she felt like collapsing into nothingness. She turned her tear-streaked face toward her, her voice cracking. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this. But I needed you to be there that day. I couldn't survive it alone." The CEO's eyes softened, her usual steel melting for a brief moment. "I needed you too," she said simply, her voice quiet, as if admitting something she had never dared to say aloud. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the silence of the cemetery, the cold stone between them, and the fragile truth hanging in the air. Their faces inched closer, the magnetic pull undeniable, until their lips hovered a breath apart. She could feel the warmth of her breath, the trembling of anticipation, the rush of something forbidden but impossible to deny, and then guilt struck her like a slap. She pulled back abruptly, wiping her face, her chest tightening. What was she doing? How could she even think of this, here, in front of his grave, with the sister he had left her for in his absence? Shame burned through her veins, and she looked away, unable to meet the CEO's eyes. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy, until the CEO's voice broke it, low and steady. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to be ready. I'll wait." The gentleness of the words caught her off guard. She expected impatience, frustration, anything but patience. Yet there it was, calm, unwavering, offering her space even when she didn't ask for it. She swallowed hard, her heart torn between grief and something new, something she didn't yet have the courage to name. They walked back to the car hand in hand, neither of them speaking, both lost in their thoughts. The contact was subtle, but it was enough to anchor her, to remind her she wasn't walking alone anymore. Back at the mansion, she drifted into a daze, her mind replaying the near kiss over and over. She told herself it was a mistake, that she had been vulnerable, overwhelmed by grief, reaching for the nearest comfort. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. There had been a pull between them long before today, in the way the CEO looked at her, in the way her presence soothed the storms inside her. She couldn't pretend she didn't feel it anymore, not after her body had leaned so naturally toward hers, not after her heart had raced with the possibility of something real. That night, sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the memory of the cemetery haunting her. The way her heart had split open at the grave, the way her tears had been caught not by the man she had loved but by his sister, the woman who was now her wife. The irony twisted inside her, cruel and strange, but there was something else too, a glimmer of gratitude, a fragile sense of being cared for in her darkest hour. She rolled over, clutching the pillow to her chest, her thoughts tangled and restless. Somewhere deep down, she realized she was beginning to heal, not because of time, but because of the woman who refused to let her break completely. The following days carried a different kind of energy between them. There was a new tenderness in the way the CEO brushed her hand against hers when they walked together, a new warmth in her eyes when they shared quiet meals. It wasn't spoken, but it was there, simmering beneath every glance, every small touch. And though she still carried the weight of grief, though guilt still whispered in the back of her mind, she couldn't deny that something fragile and real was growing in the cracks of her broken heart. It terrified her, but it also gave her something she hadn't felt in weeks, hope. The weeks after the cemetery visit unfolded like a slow unraveling of the life she thought she understood. Something had changed between them that day. It wasn't spoken out loud, but it lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable, shaping the way they looked at each other, the way they moved around each other, the way silence between them no longer felt empty but charged. She found herself noticing details she had ignored before, the way the CEO's eyes softened when she thought no one was watching, the subtle kindness in the way she always made sure her glass was filled before her own, the protective glance she cast whenever cameras flashed around them. Every little gesture felt like a thread weaving them closer together, and she didn't know how to stop it even if she wanted to. One evening, they attended a gala. It was one of those glittering events where appearances mattered more than truth, where every smile was calculated, every handshake a silent negotiation. She had dreaded going, the thought of walking into a room full of people who still whispered about the altar and the scandal that followed. But the CEO stood beside her like a fortress, her hand steady on her back as they entered. The stares came, as expected, sharp and probing, but this time they didn't sting as much. When she wavered, the CEO leaned close, whispering, "Let them look. They can't touch us." The words carried such quiet authority that for the first time, she believed it. They danced together under the golden lights, not as strangers tied by circumstance, but as partners whose movements began to sync effortlessly. For a moment, surrounded by music and murmurs, it felt real, not an arrangement, not a facade, but something alive. When they returned home that night, flushed from the weight of the evening, she lingered in the hallway instead of retreating to her room. The CEO stopped, arching a brow as if to ask why, but then their eyes met, and the question faded. They stood there in the dim light, the silence thick with the things neither dared to say. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, her chest rising and falling too quickly. And then, without warning, she stepped forward and kissed her. It wasn't a careful kiss, not a tentative brushing of lips, but a desperate release of everything she had been holding back. For a heartbeat, she feared she had made a mistake, that the CEO would pull away. But instead, strong hands gripped her waist, drawing her closer, deepening the kiss until the world around them disappeared. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, she searched her eyes for regret, for hesitation, but there was none. Only fire, steady and unshaken. "You don't have to be afraid," the CEO whispered, her voice low and rough. "Not with me." Those words sank into her like a promise, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe in something new. The kiss had unlocked something between them, a door neither could close again, no matter how hard they tried. They didn't rush, though. The days that followed were not filled with dramatic confessions or grand declarations. Instead, it was in the small, quiet moments that their bond grew deeper, the CEO brushing her hair back when she fell asleep on the couch, the way their fingers intertwined without thought as they walked together, the laughter that bubbled up when they teased each other over silly things, but the outside world didn't soften just because they had. Whispers turned into speculation. Tabloids splashed headlines about their fake marriage, hinting at scandal, questioning motives. Reporters dug into her past, painting her as a gold digger, someone who had only married into the family for wealth and status. Each headline sliced her confidence thinner, each rumor a shadow she couldn't escape. One evening, she broke down again, tossing the magazine across the living room, her voice trembling with anger. "I can't do this. They'll never believe me. They'll never see me as anything but a replacement for what I lost." The CEO watched her quietly, her expression unreadable, then rose from her chair and crossed the room. She took her face gently in her hands, tilting it until their eyes locked. "Let them talk," she said, her tone sharp, commanding. "The only truth that matters is the one we live. Do you understand me?" Those words carried a weight that steadied her. She realized then that the CEO wasn't just fighting for her reputation or for appearances, she was fighting for her, for them. That night, they sat together on the couch, her head resting against the CEO's shoulder, the flicker of the fireplace casting warm light around them. For the first time, she felt safe, not because the world had stopped judging her, but because she no longer cared as much. She had someone who stood beside her, someone who refused to let her drown in doubt. Slowly, she began to see that this strange marriage wasn't just survival anymore. It was becoming the home she never thought she'd find. Yet even as hope blossomed, fear lingered in the background. She knew falling in love with her was dangerous. The world outside their walls was ruthless, waiting for them to slip, waiting to devour any weakness. And deep inside, she feared that love built on broken beginnings might collapse just as easily as it had begun. But every time the CEO reached for her hand, every time her voice softened when it was just the two of them, every time her lips pressed against hers in the quiet hours of the night, she chose to believe. She chose to stay. The days that followed felt like standing on the edge of something fragile, a bridge built on trust that could collapse at any moment. Their bond had grown stronger, yes, but with that strength came the sharp awareness that the world was circling them like predators waiting for blood. The newspapers had grown bolder, whispering about secrets, about forbidden feelings, about how everything between them was nothing more than an elaborate cover-up. Strangers with cameras lurked at the gates of the mansion, ready to capture even a fleeting glance of them together. At first, she tried to block it all out, to focus only on the warmth of the CEO's hand in hers, the safety she felt in the quiet of their shared home. But whispers have a way of seeping through cracks, and soon she couldn't avoid them anymore. One evening, after returning from yet another business dinner where she had been paraded at the CEO's side, she crumpled onto the edge of her bed, her chest tight with exhaustion. She could still hear the voices of the people at the table, their polite smiles failing to mask the curiosity in their eyes, the way they studied her like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. She wanted to scream, to tell them she wasn't some replacement bride, she wasn't some scheme to save face, she was human, she was hurting, she was trying. But she didn't. She swallowed it all down until it burned her from the inside. When the CEO found her sitting in the dark, knees drawn up to her chest, she didn't ask what was wrong. She simply sat beside her, silent, her presence steady. Minutes passed before she finally broke. "They'll never see me as yours." "Not really. They'll always think I'm nothing more than his leftover." The words hung in the air, raw and jagged. The CEO turned to her slowly, her gaze sharp and unyielding, but beneath it there was something softer too, something vulnerable. "Do you really think I care what they see?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't want them to see you. I want you to see you. And I want you to see me." She reached out then, her fingers brushing her cheek, tilting her face up until their eyes met. "Do you?" The question was so simple, yet it stripped her bare. Did she? Could she? She felt her throat tighten as she whispered, "I want to. But I'm scared." And in that moment, she felt something shift inside her, like the first crack of dawn after an endless night. They began spending more time together away from the public eye, small moments that no headline could capture. Cooking breakfast side by side in the quiet of the morning, walking through the gardens with laughter spilling between them, lying awake at night sharing fragments of their pasts. The CEO told her stories she had never shared with anyone, about the weight of inheriting a company so young, about the loneliness of being respected but never truly known, about the walls she had built to keep herself safe. And she listened, realizing that beneath the power and control was a woman who had longed for connection just as much as she did. Slowly, the distance between them dissolved, and what remained was startling in its honesty, but as their closeness grew, so did the scrutiny. A leaked photo of them holding hands at a charity event spread like wildfire, sparking headlines that were equal parts fascination and venom. Critics accused her of manipulating her way into power, while others accused the CEO of tarnishing her family's name. The pressure mounted until it spilled into their home. One night, after a particularly cruel article painted her as a heartless opportunist, she exploded, pacing the room with tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be strong every second of every day. I can't keep pretending I'm not breaking inside." The CEO stepped forward, catching her wrist, forcing her to stop. "Then stop pretending," she said firmly. "You don't have to be strong for me. I don't need a perfect partner. I need you. Just you." Her voice cracked slightly, the first time she had ever let her own mask slip. "Do you think this is easy for me? To watch the world tear you apart when all I want is to keep you safe? I would give up everything, every deal, every dollar, every ounce of power, if it meant you'd believe you are enough." The rawness in her tone broke something open, and suddenly the distance between them collapsed. She fell into her arms, sobbing into her chest, and for the first time in weeks, the tears didn't feel like weakness. They felt like release. That night, they lay tangled together in silence, their bodies pressed close, their breaths sinking as if the world beyond those walls didn't exist. She realized then that love wasn't always about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it was about surviving the storm together, about choosing each other again and again, even when everything outside screamed for them to fall apart. And though the fear still lingered, though the shadows of doubt still clawed at her, she knew something with absolute clarity: she didn't want to run anymore. Not from the whispers, not from the headlines, not from her own heart. She wanted to stay. She wanted to fight. She wanted her, but even as she clung to that truth, she knew the battle wasn't over. The world would not stop trying to break them, and there were still secrets unspoken, wounds unhealed. And yet, lying there in the safety of her arms, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be stronger than all of it. The storm finally came when neither of them expected it. For months they had lived in a fragile peace, balancing the growing weight of their feelings with the sharp judgment of the outside world. But peace never lasts long when people are waiting for you to fail. It started with a leak. An insider from the company released private documents to the press, painting her as a manipulative pawn who had married into the family to gain influence over the empire. The story exploded overnight, every headline screaming betrayal, every commentator dissecting her motives. Reporters swarmed the gates again, investors demanded explanations, and whispers in hushed boardrooms spoke of replacing the CEO herself. It was no longer just gossip, it was war. She felt the weight of it crush down harder than ever before. Every step she took inside the mansion felt like walking on glass, every glance from the household staff seemed to carry silent judgment. She began to withdraw, avoiding the CEO's eyes, afraid that maybe the story would plant a seed of doubt in her heart too. Maybe she would start to believe the lies, to see her not as a partner but as a liability. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if walking away was the only way to protect them both. But even as the thought twisted inside her, it tore at her heart, because the idea of leaving felt like cutting herself open. The CEO, however, refused to let the storm control her. She stormed into meetings, silenced the board with her unflinching presence, and declared in no uncertain terms that the woman they were tearing apart was not a pawn but her wife. Her voice was fire, her resolve unshakable, but when she came home at night, the cracks showed. She would pour herself a drink, stand by the window for hours in silence, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. One night, when she thought she was alone, the CEO whispered into the glass she held, "I don't know how much longer I can fight them all." The words broke her. She rose from the couch, walked to her, and wrapped her arms around her from behind, pressing her face into her back. "You don't have to fight them alone," she whispered. For the first time, the CEO let herself lean back into her, let herself rest in someone else's strength. The breaking point came at a shareholder meeting where both of them were dragged into the spotlight. Cameras flashed, questions flew, accusations burned in the air like poison. Someone stood and shouted, "Was this marriage ever real, or was it just another business strategy?" The room buzzed, all eyes on them, waiting for the truth to crack open. She felt her chest tighten, panic clawing at her throat, but then the CEO's hand slid into hers beneath the table, steady and strong. And before the CEO could speak, she rose. Her voice trembled at first, but then it steadied as the words poured out. Yes, it started as something unexpected. It started in pain, in shame, in brokenness. But what we have now is real. More real than the shallow smiles and backroom deals this room has seen for decades. You can call me names, you can write your stories, but you can't take away what we've built together. You can't take away love. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. Then the CEO stood beside her, slipping an arm around her waist in full view of the cameras. "You heard her," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "This is my wife. This is my partner. And if you want to attack her, you attack me. And I promise you, I don't lose battles." The declaration hit like a thunderclap. The murmurs rose, but this time they were different, not fueled by disbelief but by the undeniable truth that radiated from the two of them standing side by side. The story spread, of course, but the narrative shifted. They were no longer just scandal or spectacle. They were defiance, they were resilience, they were love refusing to bow. When they returned home that night, the air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. She collapsed onto the couch, drained, her body trembling from the adrenaline. The CEO knelt before her, taking her hands gently. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, but her eyes shone with pride. "Yes, I did," she whispered back. "Because I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being afraid. I love you. And if the whole world wants to know, then let them." The words tumbled out, raw and unpolished, but they were the truest words she had ever spoken. For a moment, silence stretched between them, and then the CEO leaned forward and kissed her, slowly, deeply, with a tenderness that shattered every wall left standing. It wasn't a kiss born of desperation or secrecy. It was a kiss of homecoming, of finally stepping into the light together. They held on to each other as if the world could fall apart and it still wouldn't matter, because they had found something worth surviving for. The months that followed were not easy. There were still battles, still whispers, still days when the pressure threatened to swallow them whole. But they learned to face it together, not as a facade, not as an arrangement, but as two women who had chosen each other against all odds. And in choosing each other, they found freedom. She no longer felt like the abandoned bride left trembling at the altar. She was something else now, stronger, braver, loved. And as for the CEO, the woman who had once been untouchable and alone, she found something she had never dared to hope for, someone who saw her not as a leader or a fortress, but as a person who deserved to be loved too. They weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. Because in a world that had tried to write their story for them, they had written their own ending. And it wasn't about scandal, or power, or appearances. It was about love born from ashes, love that refused to be silenced, love that healed what had once been broken. It was messy and complicated and fierce, and it was theirs. Forever.